All right, hello again and welcome back. In this video, what we're going to do is continue our exploration of insect biodiversity, particularly thinking about first both patterns of biodiversity, where and why are there more insect species in particular places, and then also start thinking about what that diversity really means. So thinking about the links between the diversity of species and the roles that they play in ecosystems, which we've been learning about all semester, and trying to think about how that links to the delivery of ecosystem services that we as humans care about, as well as basic ecosystem function. So first, just a little bit of sort of vocabulary, and these are likely familiar terms that you might have seen in former ecology classes. But when we think about diversity of insects or any other or organisms, really, we can think about this as occurring at different scales. And one is the sort of local community scale that you might have heard of as alpha diversity before, but I like this local community as I think a bit more descriptive. This is, say, within a habitat, how many different kinds of species there are. And that might be different than how much diversity occurs among habitats. So if we move from one sort of local habitat to another, how many across these local communities, how much diversity is there? And then we can think about zooming out again and thinking about a regional, this sort of collection of habitats in a whole region, say here in the upper Midwest, what's the total diversity at that scale? And so again, this is, you might have heard of as alpha, beta, and gamma diversity, but I like to think of as local community among habitat diversity, and then this whole collection of all the habitats in a region diversity. And in addition to thinking about diversity at different scales, we can also think about the many different kinds of diversity, right? So diversity can mean different things depending on what kind of question you're interested in. So one sort of simple way to think about diversity is really just the number of species. So we count species, we've identified all the different insects in our area, say, and then we just count up either in the local community or again across scales how many species there are. And we think of that as species richness. But in some ways, that doesn't capture all the aspects of, or one aspect of diversity that doesn't capture is how phylogenetically diverse an assemblage of species is. So if we think about, for example, here just an example, beetle phylogeny, if we have, say, 3 species that are very closely related within the evolutionary history of beetles, and compare that to, say, 3 species that are widely distributed across this tree and diverged many more millions of years ago than our closely related group, even though the number of species is the same, the diversity in terms of phylogenetic history among those groups is quite different. So if you have groups that are more distributed across the phylogenetic tree, we would consider those more phylogenetically diverse, even if it's the same number of species. And we won't go too much into the detail of how you calculate this, but often one way of thinking about the phylogenetic diversity is just looking at species on an evolutionary tree like this, and then actually integrating the branch lengths. So longer branch lengths means sort of deeper divergence in evolutionary time, and therefore more phylogenetic diversity. And this can really matter from a functional perspective, especially when we think about conservation. So there might not be as much value in, let's say, conserving a group of really closely related species that might not have as much sort of ecological diversity, or again, phylogenetic diversity, genetic diversity as more sort of distributed trees or, an assemblage of species. So this phylogenetic diversity can have practical importance too. And finally, potentially related, but also conceptually distinct, is thinking about the functional diversity. So again, we can bring back our concept of the niche, here sort of shown in one dimension, but we can think about the Hutchinsonian n-dimensional hypervolume too, but really thinking about the diversity of ecological and functional space that these species occupy. And often, but not always, this is related to phylogenetic diversity. So often over evolutionary time, for example, through adaptive radiations, as species become more diverse, they also occupy more in different niches. So ecological sort of functional diversity might be related to phylogenetic diversity, but not necessarily. So these are distinct. If we think about broad patterns of diversity, we've already learned about last week a couple of the really important rules that seem to be driving diversity more at a local-ish scale. So if we think about species area relationships, for example, on islands or within forest fragments, we do know that larger areas tend to contain more species. We can also learn a little bit about dispersal dynamics and thinking about the role of island biogeography theory in driving local patterns of diversity. But if we move out to the sort of global scale, one of the really, really striking patterns is that there's a very strong latitudinal gradient in diversity in insects that parallels that in many, many other groups of plants, vertebrates, and many other groups. So there's very strong global gradients in diversity, and with lots more species occurring in the tropics. The reasons for this have been hotly debated for a long time now, and there are many hypotheses about why this might be true, including sort of fundamental biophysical and energetic models, more biogeographical and historical models. For example, that just the areas in the tropics have been around for longer and didn't get glaciated, so they've had more time to sort of speciate. The stability, we learned about this earlier in the semester, thinking about Jansen's idea of the mountains being higher in the tropics, so maybe there's more narrow ecological tolerance or ecological niche breadth. So finer partitioning of ecological space. So just to say, you don't have to know those mechanisms, but just want to highlight that there are a lot of competing and hypotheses about why there might be more species in the tropics, and this is kind of still an open and interesting area for debate. But it's also, even though it's a very strong trend, it's not a rule, and there are important exceptions to this. So one fun example is this is gall making. These are the gall midges, so they show actually a peak in abundance around 35 degrees north or south, and that's parallel in both the northern and southern hemisphere. And also actually bees follow this pattern. So if we look at the global diversity of bee species richness, this doesn't actually occur in the tropics. The peaks are often in latitudes, these sort of more temperate latitudes, and particularly in the U.S. in the more dry and warm regions is where we see a lot of the highest diversity, for example, in the Southwest here in the U.S. And that is likely related to, for bees at least, we think that might be related to degrees of specialization and generalization, where in the tropics we have a high abundance of social species that are highly generalist and maybe outcompete more specialist species, whereas in temperate regions we have a higher richness of solitary and often specialist species. But again, that's actually really still an open question, a hypothesis of why bees don't follow this sort of dominant pattern of latitudinal gradients. So strong pattern, but with important exceptions. Okay, so now if we think about some of those broad patterns of diversity, now what we're going to move to is thinking a little bit about what that diversity really means for ecosystem function. And there's a strong intuition, I think often, that higher biodiversity equates with better performing ecosystem function and potentially delivery of ecosystem services. And so, for example, don't worry about knowing these particular graphs, but this is just actually from a systematic review looking at the relationship between species diversity and ecosystem function across a lot of different metrics and studies, showing in general some fairly strong relationships between biodiversity within systems and also metrics of their function. For example, total biomass generated is one of these fairly well-established relationships, but particularly in plants. So a lot of these studies are from plants, showing that as you have more species diversity in a system, you get higher productivity in those systems. But is that true for insects? So there have been some nice recent studies really trying to explicitly link, working across sort of meta-analyses of studies happening across the globe. And in particular here, this is a nice recent study that tried to look explicitly at these links between richness and delivery of ecosystem services in agroecosystems for two groups: pollinators, delivering pollination services that crops depend on, and pest control services. And these are shown on the left and right. So on the left here is pollination services, and on the right is pest control. And what this study found is that indeed there is a fairly strong and robust relationship between species richness and the delivery of pollination services. And again, for pest control services that higher diversity of natural enemies leads to more effective pest control. So some evidence, at least, that species richness and diversity actually does relate to ecosystem function. Okay, so why might that be? Why would diversity actually matter? What are the mechanisms sitting under that? So think a little bit about, I'll talk in particular about pollinators, but these ideas really matter or potentially apply to a lot of different systems. One simple way in which we think diversity probably matters is really niche complementarity. So if we think about any environmental variable here, this could be temperature, but in plants, of course, this could be, drought conditions, really any environmental variable that might matter for your group. Each species, if they occupy different niche space, that can improve pollination across a range of conditions. So, for example, if you have a warm and a cold adapted pollinator species, if you have both of those working together, you get more overall pollination under variable conditions than if you only have one of those species. So this sort of niche complementarity idea. But also, one reason that biodiversity might really matter is not necessarily that species have very distinct niches to start with, but that if one of those species drops out, for example, through local extirpation or extinction, that can lead to basically having multiple species with overlapping niches can give you some insurance. So you maintain functionality even in light of declining species. So you might remember from Dr. Olivia Bernauer's guest talk thinking about the loss of, for example, honeybees, and this is really a bit of a global concern. If we have one species that we depend on a lot for delivery of an ecosystem service like pollination, having multiple species that can play that role provides really important insurance against the loss of a single particular species. So complementarity can be important, this insurance idea, biodiversity insurance. And there are also some other interesting mechanisms there. And one is sometimes even if you start with species that could potentially have overlapping niches, for example, here if we look at diet, competition, as we've seen through, for example, competitive exclusion, can drive divergence of those niches. So for example, if we have competitive exclusion, you might end up in a place where you have more complementarity. So this is sort of facultative complementarity, you can think of it in some ways. So if you had just one of these species, even though in separation they might have similar niches, when they're in the same sympatric population, if they're competing, then they might diverge and provide more robust ecosystem services or ecosystem function across a range of conditions. And why, again, does this really matter for us? So one example that you've heard a bit about pollination, but just to bring this home again, is pollinators of not just honeybees, but many other species of the almost 20,000 other species of bees are incredibly important for the delivery of pollination services to crops. So coffee is one that many of us happily consume large amounts of. So this is actually, coffee is the second highest value commodity product globally after oil. And so just enormous productivity, about 152 million 60-kilogram bags just in an old estimate from 2016. And to get that, so that consists of about 91 trillion coffee beans, and to get that, you need about 22 trillion pollinator visits. And the importance of pollinators isn't just for our, we might argue as a bit of a luxury in coffee, but this is also really fundamental to our health and nutrition. So this is a nice sort of photo essay put together with Whole Foods a few years ago, but just pulling all the pollinator-dependent foods from some of the shelves in Whole Foods. Here on the left, sort of the full products, and on the right, all of the vegetable and produce section with the pollinator-dependent crops removed. And so just really visually highlights the importance of pollinators for food production. About a third of food comes from crops that to some extent depend on animal pollination, in particular insects. And if we look at not only what would happen if all pollinator populations collapsed, but even existing yield gaps. So the difference in global production systems and crop systems between what crops could produce and what they do produce, so that we think of that as the yield gap. About 25% of existing yield gaps might be due to a lack of sufficient pollinators, particularly in small farms, often subsistence farms globally. So what that means is that there is a real world impact of ongoing insufficient pollination for food production globally. And there are incredibly important human health implications of that dependence of our food system on pollinators. And in particular, because the crops that are pollinator dependent, like fruits, nuts, and vegetables, because those tend to be particularly rich in micronutrients like vitamin A and folate, deficiency in those can actually have really, really critical impacts on human health that can actually be quantified. This is a nice recent study, or a study from a few years ago, but where they looked at the potential effects via micronutrient deficiency in particular on human health. And what they found is potentially up to almost 1.5 million additional deaths annually, just from lack of sufficient pollination in our food system. So takeaways are that biodiversity really matters, and if we take pollinators as one example, we know that diversity of pollinators is critically important for the delivery of pollination services in food systems, and that ecosystem service in particular is incredibly important for our own human health. So a clear link between diversity and our own well-being and ecosystem services.